Welcome to Eastlake. We are an inclusive faith community dedicated to the free search for truth and meaning, seeking to live out a more just and life-giving spirituality in the modern world. We see faith as less about doctrines and dogmas demanding total agreement, but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others. What unites us is a growing awareness that life is a gift and love is the point. We welcome the entire human family, regardless of race, age, creed, physical abilities, marital or economic status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So if you are curious and have come to see, if you are tired and have come to rest, if you are grateful and have come to share, if you are journeying and have come to grow, if you are wounded and have come to heal, if you are joyful and have come to shine, welcome home. Today, Kristen and Peter talk with Dr. Sarah Hanson as they continue our series on mental health. What's on your mind? Please check the description for links to our quarterly Spotify playlist and guided meditation.
Well, hey, Eastlake, it's Kristen and Peter here with our friend, Dr. Sarah Hanson, and we are continuing this series on mental health. And we asked Sarah to join us today to talk about anxiety. It's something that we hear about often these days, and I think it'll be a great opportunity to hear from Sarah to get more specifics on what exactly is anxiety. How do we work with people in our life who deal with that on a daily basis to separate some truths from rumors or myths, or how do we understand what this is? So Sarah, we're really excited to have you here. I did say to Sarah and Peter, I'm going to try really hard to make sure this is not a personal therapy session between me and my friend therapist, Sarah.
Yeah. That would be fun to observe, though. Just to be clear, I'd like to be a fly on the wall for that.
Well, some of the emails that we exchange ahead of this are like, this might be too personal, but here's a thought. So Sarah, first of all, I would love for you to kind of intro your relationship with anxiety and how you're going to be approaching this conversation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, I'm excited to be here. I've been really anxious as I've been preparing for a talk on anxiety. So I'm really happy for it also to be over, because I think true to what anxiety is, the more that you spend time with it, the more you feel it, and the more you feed it, the larger it grows. So I think I haven't had to hone in like this for a long time on anxiety. And so I've been feeling all of it, which we'll kind of get to. But I think starting off, I want to give a just an awareness that I'm coming from it from, I have my master's and my doctorate in counseling psychology. I've been practicing for 12 years. I've seen a lot of people come in with, symptoms of anxiety, and how that looks can be different for each person. Whether or not people have an actual diagnosis or not, anxiety is something that comes up, almost every time I have a session with someone. And then, so I have that brain, my psychology brain, is on. And then I also just have my own experience and personal experience with anxiety, and probably the ways I've coped in unhealthy or not productive ways, ways that I've probably managed it and coped with it in a lot of different ways. And so I have that side of me as well. And so I'm going to be doing my best to speak from both and be able to have the kind of the empathy and the compassion and the real experience come through, but also my expertise and, what I do for a living also come through. And also, while I try to do that, it's also going to be times where you're like, I feel like you just contradicted yourself. And that will be true many times, most likely. I also just want to say a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is directly from Brené Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart, that I think I talked about at that beginning one too. She goes through 87 different emotions, and thankfully she talks about anxiety. And so a lot of what I'm going to be sharing is from that book. So if anyone wants to pick that up, I'd highly recommend it. But I'll just start with, when you think about anxiety, I think people think, stress, overwhelmed, high strung. I don't know. There's so many different, worry. There's a lot of different terms that we throw around, and people typically don't know the difference. And I don't think it actually necessarily matters unless you're really trying to communicate something and you're not, that's not being communicated to the people that you're in a relationship with. So I think what is important to know about anxiety is that it's cognitive, which means it's in our minds and it's mental, and it's physical. And that's where it kind of differs from other emotions and other experiences. Anxiety involves the past, which is the hypervigilance that people tend to, because of the past, they're scanning for danger right now. But they're pulling from things from the past. It involves the present, which is fear. Like fear only lives right now, right here. And then it involves the future, which is dread and worry. And so I think with that, you can get this picture that it's not simple when you think about this overarching thing of anxiety, and that typically the other terms you hear, worry, stressed, overwhelmed, fall underneath this big umbrella of anxiety because it's all encompassing all of those things.
Quick kind of pause there. Question for you. So you were saying hypervigilance. Can you kind of dive into what you mean by that? Is that just I think I'm tracking for the most part, but I'd love to hear you dive into a little bit more.
Yeah. A lot of times, I think this is probably a lot of people's experience with anxiety, is there's a sense of constantly scanning for danger, or having a sense of always being ready. Like I need to be ready, and my body and everything is responding to stimulus out there. And it's like, it doesn't take much to put someone that struggles with anxiety, or that's just their propensity to go into fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that comes from this sense of like, I'm going to just be scanning and scanning. Does that help? I would say that's what I would say. Hypervigilance is just that. I feel like there's danger lurking, and I need to be really prepared and ready at all times for it.
Got it. But I think you brought that up in relationship to typically the past. So something in our experience has taught us that we need to be on watch.
Yeah.
But also, like, I'm assuming evolutionarily, like the reason our species has survived is because we have had some mechanism to be on guard, not die.
That's it. And it's a good
default
thing, right? It's a good thing. Like there's times where our fight, flight, freeze, that part of our nervous system is there to protect us. It's there to help with our survival. And I think we sometimes talk so often about how it's negative, and we forget that, like, yes, but it also absolutely serves a purpose. It's just that when I'm sitting on my couch and it's just the way that I'm processing something, that if I go into fight, flight, freeze mode, then my body's like, there is no tiger. Like there's nothing actually coming at me, but my body thinks there is. And then I go about my day like nothing happened. And I haven't really, we call it this completing the stress cycle, which is this other amazing book called Burnout that talks about that this need to have this full completion that typically, right, in those all those years ago, if there was like a caveman running away from a tiger, right, if they got away from the tiger, they would go back to the village and there would be this like huge, like, oh my gosh, we got away from the tiger, like celebration and release of energy. And they would have actually physically been running. And so there was this full circle cycle that happens. But now, that we don't do that. We don't like sprint down the road when every time we're feeling this buildup of emotions and feelings and everything. And
should we sprint? Should I start doing that?
You absolutely should. They do say like the best way to complete the stress cycle is physical exercise. So if you find that you had just gone through something where you did have that elevated heart rate, the sweaty palms, like you just felt really heightened, I would say, and then it whatever the stimuli or the stressor goes away, the best thing you can do is like just drop and give me 10. Like just do some push-ups, like get some of that energy out physically.
Yeah.
And typically you'll be better off. But
just a quick note about the physical part of it, of the experience. Like I said, I'm not going to keep this as a personal therapy session, but I did end up at the doctor thinking I was having like a heart attack or something. And I think they do this for people. He did like the tests and stuff. And he was like, I think this is anxiety. And I was like,
yeah.
What? You mean I'm not dying? I feel like my heart's about to explode.
Yes.
So
yes.
Besides that, what are some of these like physical, why is that different from worry?
Yes. So I want to talk about that because it's very important to know that. So I think Peter had mentioned the DSM-5 at that first talk, but the DSM is kind of how we do diagnoses. And there's a lot of different feelings about it. Some people hate it and think it's, the harm of labels, which is legit, right? And a way to, and insurance companies and all of the things, but it is helpful for defining and to help to get the differential, right? Like what's the difference between all of these things? And so in the DSM, there's quite a few different diagnoses that have to do with anxiety. You can't get diagnosed with anxiety, like just plain anxiety is not actually a thing. You can get there's one called generalized anxiety disorder, and then social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, there's phobias, there's agoraphobia, and there's separation anxiety disorder. Those are kind of the main ones that have to do with anxiety. And even just hearing them, you get a little bit of sense of the differences between them. And the thing they all have in common is just that there is that unease. There's that physical, cognitive unease, distress, and that comes with it. So I want to talk a little bit. Let me just talk about the generalized anxiety disorder, and then Kristen, how that is different than what you're talking about, which is more of like a panic attack or a panic disorder. And I think it's really important to kind of know, and at least you can have an idea that they're different. So the generalized anxiety disorder is defined as a condition of excessive worry about everyday issues and situations, which is key, like everyday situations, right? So it is very common and typical for all of us to have stressors and worries throughout the day, and life, and different life events that happen. But this is that it's an everyday situation and you're having excessive worry. It has to last longer than 6 months. And this is key. In addition to worried, you may feel restlessness, fatigue, trouble concentrating, irritability, increased muscle tension, and trouble sleeping. And so then with those additional ones, you can see how it really starts impacting people's quality of life overall. I really relate to the irritableness. I think if that was a diagnosis, like just irritable.
It's hard to separate that. Is that just my children, or is that, it's hard for me. I can't tell.
I find that my anxiety really takes on that. So the difference of the panic disorder. So a lot of times people get diagnosed with that, and then they get diagnosed with panic disorder. And panic disorder is that you've experienced a panic attack, which is a very significant period of time. I would say some people will say, oh, I had a panic attack for an hour. No, you didn't. You might have been recovering for an hour, but a panic attack, we're talking like 3 to 10 minutes max. I would say max 10 minutes would be very long. But you do truly feel like you're dying. you really, it does look and appear even from the outside that the person is having a heart attack or is in dire, I mean, like there's no hiding it. You do feel like your heart is pounding out of your chest. Your breathing is absolutely irregular. You are sweaty. You are experiencing all of those symptoms. So it is smart to go to the doctor. Like, don't just assume it's anxiety either, right? Like, hey, make sure you do know what's going on, because that's important. But if that is something that, the doctor has said, actually, your heart, everything looks fine, it really is anxiety, then it is about looking how you're going to treat panic attacks. And what's so hard about panic attacks is that once you've had one, the fear of having one again is what tends to then lead you to have one again. And it is this perpetuating terrible cycle that oftentimes medication is necessary to help your body recognize that it doesn't need to do that, because once you get into that pattern, it's hard to get out of it, especially for people who are having them daily or every few days, right?
Thanks for explaining
about that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
I had a kind of a question related to that. So I'm assuming, and I think you spoke to this a bit, but there's obviously, I think when you highlighted those 5 categories within, what is I think classified as, these are having the word disorder, anxiety disorder, panic disorder.
Yeah.
Those would be, I would assume, pretty severe cases of anxiety, or are like, how would you classify like there being certain types of levels? Because I'm assuming everybody listening to the discussion has felt stress, has felt worry, has felt anxiety. But what you're kind of highlighting is ongoing anxiety would be like how often you're experiencing it, the severity of how you're experiencing it. Like, are those the main factors that would drive like whether it would kind of move into the place of I have it? Like, how comfortable should we be with I have anxiety? You know what I mean? Like, how should we phrase it or not? And is that dangerous to wear as an identity? I'm experiencing anxiety. How would you kind of coach people who maybe like just to like put themselves into a bucket with these severe diagnoses versus the topic in general?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think people, I do think you have to kind of figure out for yourself, like what it is you're really experiencing. I think you're right. It's the severity of it, is the duration for sure. Like, how long has this been happening? The intensity, the intensity of the anxiety itself and how it feels. And can you go to work that day? Like, can you do your kind of normal everyday activities while you're experiencing that? And if the answer is no, okay, like that, let's get some help then for that. Right. And then, so severity, duration, and frequency, right? Like is this like all the time, or is it more situational? They talk about, there's this differentiating between trait and state anxiety. Trait anxiety is someone who says like, I'm an anxious person. Like, I was born anxious. And typically, you got, I'm a type A person. I'm overly conscientious. Like, there's the people that are just like, you would say, I was prone to anxiety. That person's just, it's not like, when people ask me sometimes like, what are you anxious about? I'm like, nothing. I'm just anxious. Like, there's like a buzz. There's like an underlying, it's like I have white noise very softly playing all the time. And it's just, and sometimes it can spike and sometimes it's just there. And I'm like, there it is. But if you were to ask me what it's about, I'm like, I don't know. But if you were to ask me, state anxiety is like, I know what I'm anxious about. That's like a situation. There's some, if you ask a person, what are you anxious about? And they answer, it's like, then they are probably in a season or in trait anxiety. That's just like a trait they're experiencing. It's the opposite. State. State, right? Where the trait is like who I am. And I think so then those are even different than generalized anxiety disorder, right? Like, that's pretty typical that you might fall into one of those categories, and if not both at times. And then it gets to a point where if you're experiencing it excessive amounts, where you can't function well. I think that's always the differentiating thing with diagnoses is your overall functioning really being impacted by the anxiety. And like social anxiety disorder is the fear of being judged by other people. And those people typically, they have a hard time just in the grocery line, because the thought of something going wrong and then people watching them and what that does to them mentally is enough for them not to want to go to the grocery store. Right. And phobias. I mean, I think there's a bunch of jokes about phobias. It's probably one of the most, how do I say this? It's like curable diagnoses you could ever get would be a phobia, because you can unlearn something that you've learned pretty much, right? So a lot of it is like that classic conditioning you learned in general psychology. Like, I can unlearn to be scared of something if I introduce it to you enough. Now, it won't be fun, because it means like spiders will have to crawl on you eventually. Just kidding. But there's actually some great YouTube videos of people. I don't know why they need to get over snake phobia. Like, it doesn't seem practical to me unless I'm going to be around them. But there is this incredible video of a woman who goes through the whole thing of like how you can get over a phobia. Yeah. It's
hard to build a career, PetSmart if you can't get over that. Though,
yeah. That's true, right? That is so true. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's interesting.
Nope. Thank you. Hey everyone, it's Kristen. Just wanted to take a moment to say thank you for tuning in. I hope that you're finding these messages helpful for you in your everyday life. That's what we're trying to do here, is gather around the idea that life is a gift and love is the point, and let's give ourselves ways to move forward in that in our own everyday world. So I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for being a part of this community. To those of you who have participated and given financially, we want to say thank you to you. Everything that we do here happens because people make contributions. People say, I value this place, I want it to exist for me and for other people, and so I'm going to support it. And so we just want to say how grateful we are that you do that. And for those of you who maybe haven't had a chance to contribute yet, we would ask you to consider maybe doing so. If you find this place beneficial, if you find these messages helpful for you, then consider joining us in that way. You can go to eastlakecc.com to make a contribution, and we just always are thankful for the people who want this place to exist. So thanks again for tuning in. Let's get back to the message.
That's helpful, I think, to understand the differences between the trait state thing. I would assume many people can relate. I can relate to that, certainly. And understanding the differences between some of what would be considered more serious.
Yeah.
And I think in general, what I'm hearing you say too is that it starts to be classified. I mean, maybe I don't know the actual term, but when it impedes your day-to-day functioning is when we should go see an expert, I'm assuming, correct?
Yeah. And before, right? Like, I think definitely go see someone if you're not able to function.
Yeah.
And I hope that people have, right? And I hope family members have helped people get that help. The thing about anxiety, I think that's hard. When you're depressed, we're not talking about depression, but let's just compare it with, there's very similar symptoms. And sometimes it can actually look so similar. But typically people with depression might get pushed to see someone first because they're not functioning. Like, they're maybe actually physically in bed and can't get out. Someone with anxiety could be as well. But I would say in the most kind of stereotypical way, someone who's depressed is, you see it, the lowness of that, I don't know, like the blues, right? We kind of talk about people like, oh, this melancholy, and the inability to function with depression. I think oftentimes people push people to go see someone because they're like, you're really sad and depressed. People with anxiety are very high functioning typically. And I think it's why there was a statistic that was like 1/3 of adults will be affected by an anxiety disorder, but fewer than half of people with diagnosable anxiety disorder seek any help. And I think it's because we do figure out how to manage it. And and there's like an applause in some ways in our society to like the high strungness and I can do everything and I can go really fast. And I think it can be seen as like a good thing sometimes, like, oh man, she's just on top of it, or he's just like a go-getter, he does everything all the time and it's all frenetic. And I'm not saying that is always, I'm not saying that's always anxiety, but I think people can figure out how to manage it in a way that it works for them. And I think that's okay, as long as you're aware that that's what you're doing with the anxiety, like that you're still aware that, oh, it is anxiety and this is how I'm managing it. And there's typically the most common two responses to anxiety is worry or avoidance. And neither are very effective, but that's typically what we do the most. And you can imagine that with worry, oftentimes people will say, it's almost superstition. Like, if I don't worry, what will happen? Because there's almost this learned thing of, if I worry enough about it, bad things won't happen. Because nothing bad has ever happened, which is not true for anyone's life. But it's like they think, if I worry that my kid might get sick, and I worry, and I think about it and I research it and they don't get sick, it's because I did that. Like, I had the control to make sure they didn't get sick by my worrying. And it's a hard thing to let go of. The other part of worrying is it gives your brain something to do. Like, there's just, sometimes I think our brains need stimuli. And when it's not stimulated, you're like, let's think of a problem to solve. And then you just start worrying about it.
Right?
Yeah.
It's using our imagination.
That's it.
Negative, right? In a negative way, for sure.
That's it. And then avoidance being the other one, which you can see can cause a lot more, we avoid in a lot of different ways. We avoid by using substances to avoid our hard and painful feelings or sensations. But we can also just build lives where we avoid the things that we don't want to see or deal with. And what I thought about as I was preparing for this talk and wanted to hear what you guys, so here's a question for you, is I feel like currently, and I love it, okay, so I'm not dissing this, but I do feel like there's a lot of emphasis on boundaries and people realizing, hey, I need to have healthy boundaries in my life. I need to make sure that I'm, not having a relationship with people that cause me to feel certain ways, and not watching things, or I need to have boundaries around social media. I need to have boundaries around all the things. And I was thinking, what is the difference between avoiding something for the sake of the same reason and having a boundary? And I feel like, I'd love to hear what you think, but I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I feel like there's this interesting, I do think there's a difference, right? And I think one can come from a place of health and one can come from a place of wanting to manage anxiety in an unhealthy way. But I also feel like, do you see that there's just that real similarity between how we can do that?
What do you think, Kristen?
Well, as you were talking, I was like, oh, I see where she's going with this. I do think that there is similarities between setting a boundary and avoiding something. Gosh, I don't know. This is something I need to think about. I guess in the true, like, if I notice that something is incredibly distressing to me, in a way that I can't, what I'm thinking about right now is reading all the news about COVID.
Right.
Is incredibly distressing to me. None of it actually changes my day, except for causing mental distress. So for me, I think I've kind of tried to put up a boundary with how much I read about the current state of COVID. And because it causes other problems where I'm like, saying to Andy, did you see this headline? Did you see this headline? And he's like, you can easily find a headline that says the opposite, and it leads to conflict and stuff like that. So I think for me, when there's something that I can't do anything to change it, then a boundary feels like maybe a good decision.
Yeah.
But if there's something where I just don't want to deal with it,
right,
and I know that there's change or something that I can do, that's probably avoidance.
Right.
I don't know.
I feel like, yes, no, I think that's exactly what I was thinking about the news as well, like the intake of the news. I was also thinking like there's times where my kid, some kids are at school and my other kids I have a free moment. And I'm always like, oh, I get super anxious, actually. Those are my most anxiety-filled moments of like, I should be doing so many things. And then I'm always like, I would rather watch Survivor. That's really what I'd rather do. And then I'm always in this battle of like, is it a boundary? Of like, I'm saying, I really deserve to sit and relax and like watch Survivor. Or am I actively avoiding something that in the end, the act of avoiding does not lead to decreased fear or anxiety. It just
laundry pile's still there.
It just delays it. Where laundry I feel like
it's
still there. Like and when they come back, I'm going to feel worse. And it's going to like, it'll just build. Where I think with your example of the boundary, it's like you having a boundary and same as me of like, I'm going to limit some of the input that we are receiving at such a frenetic level. If I put a boundary there's not like this later repercussion of that. And I feel like an avoiding habit is that in the end you're going to pay for it because you've just kind of you've just shoved it aside instead of facing it and saying, is this something I need to have a boundary?
Yeah.
Or is this something that I actually just need to push? Like I just need to push through some of the hard feelings. And I think that uncomfortable feeling, we call it sometimes in the psychology, we need to have distress tolerance. And I feel like what happens is when we completely avoid and avoid and avoid, we are really limiting our distress tolerance. And that muscle is a hard one. Like that's a hard one to try to build back. And there's ways to do it, but you have to be distressed. Like that's how you build it back. And who wants to do that? Like that's when counseling's not fun. When you're like, well, I actually think you actually need to do the hard thing to build up some of that tolerance for distress.
I was thinking when you're talking avoidance versus boundaries, the difference between like, I have an unpaid bill that I keep refusing to pay.
Yeah.
Versus I'm not going to go to TJ Maxx because I know I shouldn't be buying things. Right. So like, like an unpaid bill that's happened and this is due and it's not going away and there's going to be interest on it and eventually it's going to collections. That's like how my brain thought of avoidance.
Yeah.
Whereas like sometimes I just need to like, I'm not going shopping this month because I'm on a budget and I'm going to limit the opportunity for myself to, not live out my values. It feels like one's more proactive and the other one is more, like you say, avoiding a hard thing. So anyways, I think though, hearing you say what was kind of popping into my brain at the end there is how I think going back to the labeling thing, if we're people that are hesitant to take on challenge or to like, if we label ourselves as I can't do hard things, that creates major ripple effects and challenges in our life, right? Because anxiety, like I was just thinking, like even as we're processing this conversation, like the goal is there's no anxiety-free life, right? So ultimately, like our ability to thrive as a human has to be including skills that are how I manage my anxiety and how aware am I of my anxiety and how like what are the people that I surround myself with, what are the habits I surround myself with to navigate my anxiety way more so than like an anxiety-free life. Because even if you're on the beach, I have anxiety on vacation, knowing my vacation's coming to an end, right? So there's like 3 days left, only 3 days left on my vacation, only 2 days left and my vacation's over. So like anxiety is present. It's just how we're managing it. So anyways, hearing you say that like when we struggle to, what is it? What was the term? The muscle that's hard to build back up?
Distress tolerance.
Yeah, distress tolerance, right? Because ultimately we do need to be able to like live with anxiety at some level, right?
That's it.
Because,
I mean,
like you said, the world has things to be anxious about, and things that are scary, and that's not something that you can spend your life avoiding. It's just
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know one of the things we want to shift to is the relational aspect of being in relationship with someone.
Yeah.
But before that, I want to just ask you. You and I did like an Enneagram 6 thing a long time ago during COVID. What do you think COVID, or what have you seen COVID do to anxiety, people who are prone to anxiety, to experiencing anxiety, or people who didn't think they did? Like, what have things changed, or what do you think COVID has done?
Yeah, I do think I had a little bit of a feeling at the beginning when everyone started experiencing anxiety and being like, oh my gosh. And I felt like saying, welcome. Like, where have you been? This is how I feel all the time about everything. And also, I'm so annoyed by all your like new anxieties about it. Like, I was very annoyed. That's where my irritability comes in. I do get annoyed with that. And then, time went on and I was like, okay, I'm going to have to not be mad at everybody for having anxiety anymore. So I think some people that had not experienced it, and the uncertainty. I think that's what I talked a lot about, or I think I had written down that anxiety is an intolerance for uncertainty. That's what it is. It's like, we need to know. Like, I need to be certain and I need to know. And guess what? Like, most of life is uncertain, and there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and especially in a pandemic where we didn't know what was happening. So I think, I also think people's ability and the things that they did to cope, those were also removed. Gyms, people weren't able to work out in their normal way. They weren't able to go on vacation. They weren't able to go out to eat and drink with friends. And so then it was like both, and it was like the world felt really unsafe. And now we're taking away all of the ways that you typically cope with life. And I thought it was really important. I hope that I do feel that that there's been a shift. And I have hope that even though the longer we're in it, it's like, I'm really hoping then the changes really take place in a positive way, that people have had to learn different coping mechanisms, that I'm sure that there's ones that they are learning that are not healthy, but also I'm hoping it's teaching them like, oh, you know what? Connecting with people in this way, or being creative, having more self-care throughout my day. It kind of slowed everything down too, to have people have a moment of kind of reassessing life.
Okay. One of the things we've talked about ahead of this, and then also in our emails, is just, so there might be people listening that are like, I don't really worry that much. I just deal with what is, or, but you're most likely in relationship with somebody who experiences some degree of anxiety, whether it's situational, trait or state, I think is what you said.
Yeah.
So we'd love to hear your thoughts on, I know like when you're in a session with someone, you can't like call their spouse or their parent and to be like, hey, here's what you need to do.
Yeah.
But
this is your chance though. This is your chance.
What are some of the things you would say, like when you are in relationship with someone who struggles with this, what are some important things to know?
Yeah. So I'm going to just do an example from my own life, because I am a person that struggles, and I'm married to a person who does not struggle like at all with anxiety. I think he suppresses it real deep down as my gut. Just kidding. But he, like one time I normally have existential crises, every day, but I don't speak of them every day. And one time I said to my husband, Darren, something about like, oh my gosh, like we're going to die, can you even? And he was like, yeah, we're going to die. Like, what's for dinner? I'm like, oh, okay. So we're on a different level of anxiety. And, So I find that a lot of times in our arguments, because that's what it ends up being, is that he thinks I'm being illogical. And that's what he says. Like, this is like, you're not making any sense at this point. Like, there's no logic. And then he tries to actually argue the logic.
Yeah.
And I think, so again, everyone might.
Just for the record, that's kind of the state for my marriage too. And even like people outside of marriage, the people who I have in my life that don't struggle, like I find they will like send me information or statistics or articles to be like, what you are feeling doesn't make sense. And I've heard the illogical and the doesn't make sense thing too. And it's really hard to try to explain, right?
Right. And
is it super helpful to have those articles sent to you? Is that what you're saying?
No, because
I'm receiving some marriage advice.
Oh my gosh.
It raises the anxiety.
Yeah. You mean it's not statistically sound to think that my plane is going to crash?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you know of all the planes that have crashed? Yeah. So you're just telling me that
Malaysia flight 370, but they still have not found. Yes.
Listen, it's like a thing where as soon as you start giving me your statistics and your articles about why I'm illogical, I'm going to say Sandy Hook. Yeah. I'm going to say plane crash 9/11. And I'm going to say, I can say names of people that have died from lots of different things, right? And so what happens is then the person, so I start throwing out that and I say, no, like I don't even feel like I'm being logical. I feel like I'm giving you facts of things that have happened and you're telling me it's fine that my children go to school. And I'm saying it's not. But what happens is then my husband thinks I'm actually considering pulling my kids from school. That's not what's happening. That is not even I'm not actually thinking that way. I'm panicking because I feel unsafe and I feel my children are unsafe. And you can't argue with that. There's no statistics that are going to help my body feel safe. That's not going to work. So I feel like the best thing someone can do if you're in a conversation and you're noticing like everything I say, all they keep saying is like, but this, but this. And it's getting, they're getting angry and I'm getting angry. You're probably experiencing like, oh my gosh, this person is so freaking out. And notice your own anxiety rise as you're around people that are anxious because it's a little bit contagious. And so you're trying to suppress it also in the conversation, but I think you have to let them finish. Like, I have to say all the scariest things and I need to say them all. And then I need you to come and put your hand. Sometimes people don't want touch. Okay. So I'm not saying this for everybody, but for me, it was like, I can imagine this one time where Darren finally just came and like, he just hugged me. And it's like my body, I like just allowed it. I didn't really feel like one. I would have never asked for one, but I knew my body needed to be calmed and that felt good. And then I remember I sat down. I just remember this one specific moment about my kids going to school and me thinking everyone's going to die then I just sat there for a minute, nothing, no conversation. And I drank my coffee. And then I got up and got my kids to school. And I didn't want to talk about it. There's no reason for it. You can never reason with someone who's in that state of fear, anxiety. Yeah. And I find that the more logic and the more, this is not, you're not making any sense. And it just heightens it all.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's the calming, anything you can do to just be like, hey, I wonder if you just need a glass of water for a minute because they're not in their bodies anymore. So helping someone re-enter and calm their body down first is going to then help them move on, but it will not be solved. And I think that's what bothers people about being in a relationship with people with anxiety. It's not resolved. It's not like I feel great getting on that plane. the next time I get on a plane. It's not like I'm convinced that I'm going to be fine.
Yeah.
Because I know I'm not. I feel like you are all the people without anxiety. I'm like, you are all the people that don't understand the reality of the dangers of the world.
We're flying through the air at hundreds
We're
of miles.
flying through it's like, I can't, no.
I will say, we just got back from a trip and I started to feel the anxiety on the plane, but I was like, we're all together. So we'll at least all die together and go to whatever's next together. And that made me calm down enough to just like put my headphones in and start listening to my podcast.
And my guess is only you would be able to tell yourself that. Because if anyone else told you that, my guess is it would be, again, it's like our anxiety doesn't want to feel actually very well understood. We just need to be seen. Like, I just need you to see how much pain and freaking out I am. And I don't need you can't fix it. And I almost don't want it fixed because there's a sense of like, this is the process I have to go through to then feel I have to do it to feel okay about getting on the plane in some way.
So in a sense, it's like, pay attention, try to recognize what the person is feeling. And I think too, just listening, like hear the feelings, the fear, hear whatever the anxiety is.
And you're in a conversation at that point with the anxiety, not the person. You're not talking to me anymore. You're talking to anxiety. And you don't have a relationship with anxiety. So you don't even know how to talk about it or to it. So just try to enter back into talking to me. But I need a minute. Like, I need a minute to have my anxiety put back to where I need it to be. And you know, that I don't know how long that's going to take, right? In those moments. And sometimes it's just like, I really need to stop talking because I need to like kind of go back in and like settle my own self. I ground myself.
But I'm hearing you say it's empathy though for the feeling more so than like parceling out whether or not you should or shouldn't feel something, right? Because if we're like arguing with somebody, it's here's why you shouldn't feel this way. That just never goes good. Like I do that with my kids. Brittany's corrected me, coached me a lot. I'm now a decade into parenting, but when you were talking about the feeling versus the logic, arguing, like we were wrapping up a trip to Hawaii a couple years ago. Marshall got a sunburn on the last day. He's a little 4-year-old, so cute, but he's like loses his temper and he's sunburnt and grumpy and tired and he yells. And this is why his first time to Hawaii. And this is why I always hate Hawaii, right? And like in the moment I'm like, well, son, like you're lucky to even be here, and I never went to Hawaii when I was a kid, and you should be grateful and all this stupid stuff. But what he needs is somebody to say, I'm so sorry your sunburn's hurting, buddy. That's what he's feeling. And so I think it's a pretty natural tendency to want to, I don't know, we get defensive and it's our ego involved when we're like trying to like logic argue. It takes a different, like you have to be more aware to have empathy for a sunburnt 4-year-old or for somebody who is experiencing the feeling state of I'm nervous to get on a plane or I'm nervous to send my kid to school today.
I think I think it comes from this good place of like, I want you to feel better. Like I'm so distressed of how you're feeling. And it's like, it's so easy to not feel the way you're feeling. That's, I think, how the person is approaching it. And I think you're absolutely right, Peter. There's this sense of like, you can't actually change how someone is feeling. And the best you can do is show up and see them and sit with them. And if they've shared, maybe I think I often tell people like drink a cold glass. Like if you're in a panic, drink a cold, if you can change your body chemistry, your nervous system that is heightened can't keep up. It can't digest and panic at the same time. So the more you can drink cold water, put your feet on a cold ground, hold ice. So it could be that if they're in a panic, you have had a conversation of, this is what I need when I'm in this. Don't reason with me. Maybe go get them a cold washcloth. Like, hey, I think you might just need this right now, right? And so if there's ways that you can cue in people that like this would be helpful. And I think that's the hard part about that, going back to the state trait thing, is like, it actually is easier to respond to someone who's having anxiety in the moment.
Yeah.
A little bit harder when I talked about like that buzz just internally is happening all the time, because there's a little bit of unknowing, and then there's an unpredictability to my anxiety that I feel like I can see the unfairness and how hard that would be. And I also can have empathy for myself of like, that's why it's hard. Is like, I don't really know what's always going to happen throughout the day and what might create more anxiety than other days. So
as we get kind of to our time that we need to wrap up, is there anything that you had in your notes that you're like, I really want to share that?
I was just looking. I think I was just going to say, people that have anxiety, it is really important to get checked out by a medical provider before you assume it's anxiety, because there's thyroid issues, there's heart issues, there's other physical things that can be impacting your experience and how your body is handling things. So it's always a good thing to go get checked out. And then it's important to recognize anxiety as something that you're experiencing, not something that you are. That's where I talked about, like, you're talking to anxiety as a thing. And then the hard part, which I just ignore, but I shouldn't, is decreasing caffeine is like the number one thing. You just, if you're drinking caffeine and you're an anxious person, it's not going to be great for you. Sleep hygiene, like sleep, so important. Exercise, because of what we talked about with that stress cycle, needing to fulfill that. And then what's random is I wrote boundaries, which is funny because I have that weird conflict of like, yes, boundaries, but not avoidance, but boundaries. And I think it's a real, which is always what it is like we need to have that deep self-awareness of being able to identify when we're heightened and when we're not, or when I'm, I can tell when I get stressed that I start my paranoia. Like I go towards paranoia, which is a different type of anxiety. And I assume there's like the world is really out to get me. And whenever at this point, because I know that about myself, when I have a paranoia thought, I'm like, oh, I must be stressed. And all of a sudden it's like, because I can identify it and I can say, I know why I'm having that thought, that the thought, I know logically the thought isn't real in the sense of that's actually going to happen, but that it's because of this over here, that's why that's happening. And I feel like I can function a lot better in my life the more I've gotten to know my anxiety in that way. So I think that's my encouragement.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So helpful, Sarah. Thanks for today. Thanks
my
for
pleasure.
Sharing, bringing not only content, but some questions for us too.
Really okay.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We appreciate hearing from you. And
no
probably rope you in again soon.
Okay, I love it.
That's right.
Have a great day.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us. To make a donation, head to eastlakecc.com/donate.